Silver Creek, American West, winter of 1882. A woman on her knees in the mud. Alone. The whole town laughing. She stood up anyway. Then a man stepped out of the fog, tall as a granite wall. Eyes straight and steady. He tipped his hat. "I'm not looking for a porcelain doll to sit on a shelf." His voice rolled low like gravel. "I'm looking for a woman with hands strong enough to help me survive the winter. Will you come with me?" The platform went dead silent. She searched his face for the joke. There wasn't one. "I'll come," she said. "This is the story of a woman the world threw away and the one man who chose her anyway. Now, let's begin." The train shrieked to a stop. Iron wheels ground against the rails, throwing up a spray of gray slush that nobody bothered to step away from. Silver Creek's station platform was 3 boards nailed together over frozen mud, and the crowd standing on it didn't look much better than the planks themselves. Men in worn coats, women clutching shawls tight, a few boys throwing dirty snow at each other near the water tower. Nobody was paying attention to the train. They were all watching Abigail Vance. She was on her knees in the mud beside the platform, one hand pressed flat against the ground, the other gripping the edge of a wooden crate she'd tried to use as a step down. The crate had buckled. She'd gone down hard. Her traveling coat was soaked through at the hem. Her hat had tilted sideways, and a smear of brown mud ran from her wrist to her elbow. The laughter started from the saloon across the road. It spread fast, the way fire does when the wind is right. Lord Almighty, did the ground just give up? Someone called out, "Better call for a block and tackle." A woman near the station door covered her mouth with her glove, though her eyes crinkled hard at the corners. 2 boys stopped throwing snow and watched instead, grinning at each other. Abigail didn't look at any of them. She breathed. 1 slow breath in, 1 slow breath out. She shifted her weight, found solid ground beneath her left boot, and pushed. Her thighs strained. Her back protested. The mud sucked at her coat like it wanted to keep her down there. But she kept pushing, and after a long, ugly moment, she was standing. She straightened her hat. She picked up her carpet bag. She stepped around the buckled crate with care, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it got louder once people saw she wasn't going to cry. Abigail walked toward the edge of the platform and stood there, looking out at the town. Silver Creek. End of the line. She'd ridden 3 days on that train from a place that hadn't wanted her either. She had $11, a change of clothes, a small tin of dried chamomile, and knowledge in her head that most people in this town would never bother to learn. She had survived worse mornings than this one. Still, her jaw was tight. Her hands, wrapped around the handle of her bag, were not entirely steady. The laughter was fading now, people losing interest, turning back to their conversations. A man by the saloon said something she couldn't quite hear, and another man laughed again, and she caught the word mountain, and then a word she chose not to repeat, even in her own mind. She set her eyes on the road ahead and started walking. She heard his boots first. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of step that doesn't hurry and doesn't hesitate. She turned, and there he was. He was tall. Not in the way men sometimes seemed tall when you were sitting down. He was genuinely, remarkably tall, and broad across the shoulders, in a way that suggested the width was all muscle and bone and years of hard weather. His coat was bearskin, patched at the elbow, and his hat was pulled low. His face was dark, with several days of beard, and the permanent kind of weathering that came from living somewhere the sun and wind hit without interruption. He looked like something the mountain had made itself, and then sent down into town on some errand it hadn't fully explained. He was looking at her, not the way the saloon men had been looking at her, not measuring, not mocking. Just direct, like he'd come out here specifically to find her and was now confirming what he'd expected to see. Abigail didn't look away. She'd learned that looking away made it worse. He stopped about 3 feet from her and reached up to tip his hat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out low and rough like gravel sliding down a hillside. Jedediah Vance. I run cattle and timber up on Blackwood Mountain. She waited. I saw you 3 days back, he said. At the Halverson place, east of the mill. You helped pull a foal from a mare with a broken leg. Storm was coming in. You knew what you were doing. Abigail remembered it. The mare had been down and terrified. The foal turned wrong, the wind already picking up. The Halverson boy hadn't known what to do, and neither had his father. She'd rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work. When it was done, and both animals were breathing, she'd walked back through the snow to the boarding house without mentioning it to anyone. That was your mare, she asked. No, he said. I was there buying timber rights. I watched from across the yard. He paused. I also watched you give your last biscuit to the Halverson boy before you left. He looked hungry. You didn't say anything about it, just handed it over. She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't used to people noticing things she did quietly. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, looking out at the road for a moment, then back at her. I've been thinking on something for 3 days. A proposition. Straight and honest, no embellishment. All right, she said. I need a wife, Jedediah Vance said. My boy is 10 years old and growing up wild because I don't have the patience for the soft things he needs. My cabin gets through winter, but not comfortably. I've got land and livestock and more work than I can do alone. What I don't have is someone with a steady head and capable hands. He wasn't stumbling over the words. He'd clearly arranged them ahead of time. I'm not looking for a porcelain doll to sit on a shelf, he said. I'm looking for a woman with hands strong enough to help me survive the winter. Will you come with me? The platform had gone quiet. It happened the way quietness sometimes does in a crowd gradually, and then all at once. The men near the saloon had stopped talking. The women near the station door were staring. Even the boys had gone still. Abigail was aware of all of it. The watching, the waiting for her to be embarrassed, or grateful in a desperate way, or to stumble over herself. Accepting an offer she had no business accepting. She looked at Jedediah Vance's face and tried to find the joke in it. There wasn't one. His expression was the same as it had been when he walked up flat and serious, and a little impatient, like a man who had things to get back to. You don't know me, she said. I know you can deliver a foal in a blizzard, he said. I know you don't complain when things are hard. I know the town thinks poorly of you, and I watched you stand up just now, without asking a single person for help. He met her eyes steadily. I know enough. She thought about $11. She thought about the boarding house she'd been turned away from twice in the past month. She thought about the long, empty afternoon that was already spreading out in front of her, in this town that had laughed while she was still getting up from the mud. She also thought about what it meant to go up a mountain with a man she'd spoken to for less than 5 minutes. Your boy, she said. Does he know you're down here asking this? No, that'll be a problem. Probably, Jedediah agreed, but it's my problem and I'll handle it. Abigail looked past him at the mountain, rising blue and white, above the tree line to the north. Blackwood Mountain. She'd heard the name. People in town said it. In a voice they reserved for things they were slightly afraid of: bad weather, hard men, the kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes. She picked up her carpetbag and looked back at him. I'll come, she said. The crowd behind them was absolutely silent. Jedediah Vance nodded once, the way a man does when something has gone exactly as he planned, turned, and started walking toward the hitching post where 2 horses stood waiting in the cold. Abigail followed him. Nobody said anything, not one word. She didn't look back. The ride up took the better part of 4 hours. Jedediah didn't talk much. He pointed out a fork in the trail once, mentioned that the left path flooded in spring, and then went quiet again. Abigail didn't push. She had enough to occupy her eyes. The mountain was vast. That was the first thing. Down in Silver Creek, it looked like a wall, something flat and white and far away. Up close, riding into it, it broke apart into 100 different things. Granite shelves jutting out over the trail. Pine trees so old and thick their branches, shut out the sky in patches. Frozen creek beds that glittered under the gray afternoon light. A hawk riding a thermal high above the west ridge, so still it looked painted there. It was beautiful in the hard, indifferent way that wild country often was. It didn't care whether she found it beautiful or not. It would be here long after both of them were gone. Her horse, a solid gray mare Jedediah, called Nell, picked her way up the trail without being told. She'd done this before. Abigail kept her weight balanced and her hands easy on the reins and watched the country open up around her. By the time the homestead came into view, the light had gone flat and cold. She saw at first, through a gap in the pines, a dark shape against the snow. Then the gap widened and the full picture came clear. The cabin was large, larger than she'd expected, built from logs as thick as her waist, with a stone chimney at the east end and a covered porch running the length of the front. Behind it, a barn with a good roof. A corral, a woodpile stacked higher than the porch rail, split and stacked with the obsessive precision of a man who understood exactly what winter cost. It was a serious place. Everything about it, said the man who built it, was serious, but there was no softness anywhere. No dried flowers hanging from the porch beam, no braided rug visible through the window glass, no sign that anyone had thought about comfort in a very long time. The cabin sat there in the cold, like something bracing itself, patient and enduring and utterly alone. Abigail looked at it for a long moment before she rode through the gate. Jedediah dismounted without ceremony and began loosening his saddlebags. "Barn's warm," he said. "I'll put the horses up. Front door sticks lifted slightly when you push." She nodded and climbed down, slower than she would have liked. Her legs were stiff from the ride and her back had been complaining for the last hour. She didn't let it show. She picked up her carpetbag and walked to the front door and lifted it slightly and pushed. The smell hit her first. Old wood smoke, dried meat, pine resin, boot leather, and underneath all of it, something she didn't have a name for, a kind of grief, maybe, pressed into the walls over years, absorbed by the log and stone until it was just part of the air. The main room was large and practical. A stone fireplace on the north wall, cold now ash gray. A table built for four, with only two chairs pulled out, one clearly used far more than the other. Shelves along the east wall holding tools, tins, rope, a Bible with a cracked spine. A window facing west, clean glass, good light when there was light to be had. The kitchen corner had a good cast iron stove, a dry sink and hooks for pots. The pots were there. Serviceable, unpolished, hung by size. She put her bag down by the door and stood in the middle of the room. Somewhere deeper in the cabin, a floorboard creaked. She turned and found him standing in the hallway. He was small for 10, which surprised her, or maybe he just seemed small because he was trying so hard to seem large. His arms were crossed. His chin was up. He had Jedediah's dark coloring and something around the eyes that was his alone, a watchfulness that had been sharpened by something painful until it had an edge to it. He looked at her the way a dog looks at a stranger who has walked into its yard. "Not barking yet, but ready lie," she said. "I know who I am," he said. "Fair enough." She didn't push it. "I'm Abigail," she said. "You can call me that or ma'am if you'd rather. Either's fine." He said nothing. His eyes moved over her once, quick and assessing, and she watched him land on the obvious things: her size, her coat that wasn't quite big enough at the hem, her heavy frame taking up space in the doorway of what had been, until now, entirely his house. His expression didn't change much, but something in it settled into decision. He didn't want her here. That was plain enough. She didn't take it personally. He didn't know her. As far as he was concerned, his father had ridden down into town and come back with a stranger and no explanation. The boy had every right to be suspicious. Abigail went to the kitchen corner and opened the first cupboard. Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a half-empty sack of flour, canned tomatoes, 3 tins, lard, a jar of something that had crystallized, and she couldn't identify without more light. She found a pot, found the water bucket, found that there was a hand pump at the sink that still worked if you primed it. She primed it. She put water on. She found the dried beans and started them soaking, then went to work on the salt pork and the cornmeal. Eli stayed in the hallway. He wasn't quiet about his presence. He shifted his weight. He exhaled loudly a few times. Once he walked to the window and looked out at the barn, like he was considering whether he could get away with just leaving. Abigail didn't comment. She chopped. She stirred. She kept the movements steady and unhurried. The smell of hot stew began to fill the cabin within the hour. Salt pork and beans and a little dried sage she'd found in a tin on the second shelf. The kind of smell that reaches into a cold room and changes the quality of it. She'd learned years ago that food was one of the few things that worked across almost every disagreement. Not to fix anything, just to make people human again for a few minutes. She heard Jedediah's boots on the porch. The door lifted and opened. He came in, hung his coat and hat, washed his hands at the pump. Then he stopped and looked at the stove and at Eli still hovering in the hallway. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, calculation maybe, like a man who has set two things in motion and is now watching them try to avoid each other. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Eli, he said, come sit. Eli came to the table with the slow, deliberate steps of someone being very careful not to look like they wanted to sit down. He sat. He put his hands in his lap. He stared at the table. Abigail set a bowl in front of each of them and sat across the table with her own. The silence held for a moment. It's hot, she said. Careful. Eli looked at his bowl. He looked at it for long enough that she wondered if he was going to refuse it on principle. Then hunger won, because he was 10 years old and it smelled good, and he picked up his spoon. He ate 3 bites before he said, without looking up, it's not as salty as Papa makes it. No, Abigail agreed. I left it lighter. You can add salt if you want. He didn't add salt. Jedediah ate without speaking, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. Silence wasn't discomfort for him. It was just the natural state of things, like the cold outside or the dark coming early. When Eli had eaten most of his bowl, he pushed it slightly away and sat back and looked at Abigail with the practiced directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking. Why did my papa bring you here? He asked. Jedediah set down his spoon. His voice came out level and final. Because I asked her to come. But why her? The room went very still. Jedediah looked at his son, not with anger exactly, but with the complete, undivided attention of a man who had decided to say something important and intended for it to land properly. Appearance is something nature gives or takes away, he said, but honesty and hard work are choices a person makes. Your new mother chose kindness when the whole world was cruel to her. He held the boy's gaze. You will learn to respect that. Eli's mouth pressed closed. He didn't argue. He was clearly smart enough to understand that this particular tone of his father's voice was not an opening for debate. He looked at Abigail once more, brief and unreadable, and then he looked back down at the table. May I be excused, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, Jedediah said. Eli slid off his chair and walked back down the hallway. His door closed. Not a slam too controlled for that, just firmly shut. Jedediah picked up his spoon again. He'll come around, he said. Abigail pulled her bowl a little closer. I know, she said, and she meant it. She'd dealt with harder cases than a grieving 10-year-old, with good reasons to be suspicious of strangers. She wasn't afraid of the work. She was afraid of doing it wrong. But that was a worry for tomorrow. Tonight, the stew was hot. The wood smoke was settling back into the walls, and outside the window, the mountain was dark and cold and entirely indifferent to all of them. Abigail ate her supper and listened to the wind push against the good log walls and thought, this is where I am now. She let herself mean it. Later, when the fire was banked and the dishes were done, and Jedediah had shown her, briefly and without ceremony, the small room off the kitchen that was hers, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around. A window, a hook on the wall, a braided rug on the floor, old and faded, but there. Someone had put it there once. Someone who was no longer here. Abigail reached into her carpet bag and took out her tin of chamomile. She set it on the windowsill. Then she lay down, still dressed, and pulled the quilt over herself and listened to the mountain settle around the cabin, the creak of timber in the cold, the distant sound of wind through the high pines, and once far off, something that might have been a wolf. She was asleep before she could decide what it was. The first week on Blackwood Mountain established itself in patterns. Jedediah rose before first light. She could hear him moving through the cabin in the dark, deliberate, quiet, boots set down heel-toe, so they barely made sound on the plank floor. He was gone to the barn before she had the fire going, and he came back smelling of horses and cold air and sometimes blood if the traps had been productive. Eli rose late, which she suspected was a form of protest. He would appear in the kitchen doorway when the biscuits were already on the table, look at them for a moment, and then sit down and eat without comment. He was very good at eating without comment. He'd clearly had practice at it. Abigail rose between the two of them. She stoked the fire and started breakfast, then spent the early morning hours taking stock, the pantry, the root cellar, which was better stocked than she'd expected. Jedediah was a man who thought ahead. The kitchen garden, currently buried under a foot of snow, but clearly intentional in its layout, good soil once the thaw came. She also took stock of the house itself. The cabin was well built in the bones. The logs were fitted tight, the mortar between the stones sound, the roof solid, but it had the feel of a place maintained by someone whose mind was somewhere else. Things were functional, and nothing more. The shutters worked, but two had lost their pins and banged in a heavy wind. The kitchen shelf had a crack running through its left support that would eventually give. The porch steps, she noticed this, the first time she came down them, had a soft spot on the third board from the bottom. Her weight caught it differently than Jedediah's did. It flexed instead of held. She didn't say anything about that. Not yet. On the fourth morning, she came into the kitchen and found the porch steps fixed. New plank on the third board, cut clean and set flush, the nails hammered flat. She stood on it and tested her weight. Solid. She tested it again. Completely solid. She looked out at the barn. Jedediah was already gone. She went back inside and started the cornmeal. That afternoon, she heard the sound of sawing from the workshop, a low building behind the barn that she hadn't been inside yet. She didn't go investigate. A man's workshop was his own space until he chose to share it, same as anything else. The sawing went on for a while. Then hammering, then the drag of something heavy across the floor. At supper, she sat down in her usual place and felt immediately that something was different. The chair was wider. Not by much, a few inches on each side. The arms reset so they didn't press in at her hips the way they had all week. The joints were tight, and the finish was sanded smooth, no rough patches. It had been done carefully with time given to each step. She didn't say anything. Jedediah sat down and picked up his fork. Eli sat down across from her and seemed to notice something was different about her chair, glanced at his father's face, and decided not to mention it. Abigail served the venison and the roasted root vegetables and the skillet bread, and she ate her supper in a chair that fit her, at a table where she wasn't bracing against the arms the whole time, and she was not going to make a production out of it because Jedediah clearly hadn't intended her to. That was the thing about him she was starting to understand. He communicated in action rather than speech. When something needed saying, he said it directly in as few words as possible. When something needed doing, he did it without announcement. He didn't seem to expect thanks or even acknowledgement. He had identified a problem and corrected it and filed it away, as done the porch steps, the chair, the way he left the lantern burning in the kitchen hall the first few nights until she knew the layout well enough to move through the dark safely. None of it was said. All of it was clear. She thought about it that evening, while she went through her mending basket. Jedediah's bearskin coat had been troubling her since the first day. She'd seen him put it on in the morning heavy, good insulation, the kind of coat that would outlast both of them if treated right, but the inner lining at the collar had begun to separate, and one of the seams along the right shoulder had been patched once already, with a single thread that was pulling loose. In hard weather, that shoulder would open. Cold would get in. Coat that size, that quality, deserved better work. She found her double-threaded needle and the right weight of waxed thread in the bottom of her mending kit. She took the coat from its hook. Jedediah had gone to check the east fence line and wouldn't be back until dark, and sat by the fire, with it spread across her lap. She worked slowly and very precisely. The collar lining she pressed back into place, and stitched with a running stitch so tight the two layers became one. The shoulder seam she opened fully, trimmed the loose edges, and re-sewed with a saddle stitch, doubled twice over. That seam would hold through anything now. She went over every other seam she could reach and reinforced each one while she was at it. When she was done, she hung the coat back on its hook and put her mending kit away. Eli, who had been sitting at the table doing his sums, hadn't said anything the whole time, but she'd felt him watching her work. She was about to start on supper when she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The barn wall visible from the kitchen window was the wrong color on one end, not the weathered gray-brown of old timber. Darker, more uneven, like something had scorched it once, and the wood had absorbed it and kept the memory even after years. A charred corner, running from about the height of a man's shoulder down to the ground, black at the center and grading out to gray. She looked at it for a moment and thought about when that might have happened. Eli made a sound at the table. She turned. He'd dropped his pencil, and it had rolled off the edge, and he was reaching for it. But his face had changed. He'd followed her gaze to the barn wall, and something in his expression had shuttered down hard and fast. Not anger, more like the look of someone bracing for a noise they already know is coming. She picked up the pencil from the floor and put it back on the table without comment. "How are the sums coming?" she asked. He looked at the page. "Long division," he said. "I hate long division." "Most people do," she said. "Does your father teach you?" "When he has time." He picked up the pencil and looked at the problem on his page. "He's not good at explaining it. He just does it, and then looks at me like I should already know." Abigail dried her hands and pulled out the chair next to him. He didn't move away from her, which she took as progress. "Show me where you're stuck," she said. He showed her. She worked through it with him, not doing it for him, but asking questions. "What do you do first?" "Now what? What does that number mean?" He was actually quick once she found the right way to ask. He got through 2 problems on his own before supper was ready, and she could tell, by the way, he held his pencil differently at the end, that something had clicked. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to, but when she got up to go to the stove, he pulled the paper a little closer and started on the next problem without being told. Jedediah came in from the cold, just as she was pulling the skillet bread off the heat. He hung up his coat. She watched him reach for it and put it on the hook without looking at it closely, and washed up at the pump. He sat down. He looked at the coat once, briefly, with the kind of look that takes inventory fast. Then he looked at her. She was already setting the bread on the table. Nothing was said. The meal went on. Eli told his father haltingly, and with several corrections to his own account, that he'd figured out long division. Jedediah listened with complete attention and said, "Show me after supper." Eli nodded, like that was acceptable. Later, with the fire low, and Eli in bed. Abigail sat by the window, going through her herb tin by the last of the light, cataloging what she had, what she'd need before deep winter. She had good chamomile, some dried yarrow, a small packet of dried pine bark she'd been saving. She heard Jedediah come in from banking the fire in the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She thought he might say something about the coat, or the chair, or some arrangement about the weeks ahead. Instead, he looked at the herb tin in her hands and said, "What's that one?" "The dark stuff on the left." "Yarrow," she said. "Good for fever. Helps stop bleeding if you pack a wound with it." He was quiet for a moment. My mother used yarrow, he said. Most people did, she said. It works. He stood there another few seconds. Then he said, "Good night, Abigail. Good night, Jedediah." He went to his room. His door closed. Not quite all the way she'd noticed. He never fully latched it. In case Eli needed him in the night, she guessed. She'd noticed a lot of small things like that about him. The way the cabin was arranged so he could hear any room from his own. The way the lamps were placed so there was always a lit path to Eli's door. He was a careful father, just a silent one. She put away her herb tin and banked the kitchen fire and went to her room. The braided rug was faded, but it was warm under her feet. The window showed her a sky full of hard, bright stars above the dark mountain. She'd been here a week. It didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something was beginning. Something slow and uncertain and not yet named. Building the way a fire builds when you keep adding to it carefully, one small piece at a time, not rushing it. She was still afraid of doing it wrong. But she was still here. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark and listened to the mountain, and this time she knew what the distant sound was, and it was wolves, and they were far away, and the walls were good and solid all around her. She slept. The storm came in from the northwest, which was the worst direction. Abigail had been watching the sky since mid-morning. She'd grown up near enough to open country to know what that particular shade of yellow-gray meant in a winter sky, not the ordinary gray of coming snow, but a deeper, angrier color, pressed flat and heavy against the mountain peaks like a lid being pushed down. The air had that specific stillness before it. No birds, no wind, just cold so complete it had a weight to it. She'd told Jedediah at breakfast. He'd looked out the north window for a long moment, then nodded. "I've got 30 head on the East Range. I need to bring them in before this hits." "How long will that take?" "Half a day, if they cooperate. Longer if they don't." He was already pulling on his coat. "I'll be back before dark." She'd watched him ride out, and she'd spent the morning doing what she always did. When she was uneasy, she worked. She brought extra wood onto the porch and stacked it close to the door. She filled every large pot and bucket with water at the pump, while the pump still moved freely. She checked the kitchen stores and laid out what she'd need within arm's reach. The venison strips, the dried beans already soaked, the cornmeal, the small jar of rendered bear fat she used for the skillet. She found Jedediah's medical kit on the high shelf and opened it and took inventory. Bandage cloth, old and clean. A bottle of something clear she smelled and identified as spirits, needle, and catgut. She put the medical kit on the lower shelf where she could reach it fast. Eli spent the morning at the table with his school book, but he kept looking up at the window. He was trying not to. She could see him making the effort, staring at the page, mouthing something, then drifting again to the glass and the sky beyond it. "Read it out loud if it helps," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The passage you're working on. Reading out loud keeps your mind on the page." He looked back at his book with the expression of someone who suspects they're being managed, but can't immediately prove it. He read a few lines quietly, and then a few more, and his eyes stopped drifting to the window as often. The first serious gust hit around 2 in the afternoon. Not snow yet, just wind. Coming in hard from the northwest, rattling the shutters, and pushing under the door in a cold, thin stream. Abigail stuffed a rolled piece of burlap against the base of the door. Eli looked up from his book, and this time didn't look back down. "How bad is it going to get?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Could be bad. We're going to be fine either way." The snow started an hour later, not a gradual buildup. This storm didn't bother with gradual. The snow came sideways, and sudden, like a curtain dropped, and within 20 minutes the window was half obscured, and the sound of the wind that had gone from a rattle to a sustained roar that settled into the cabin walls and stayed there. Eli moved from the table to the fireplace, sitting close on the hearthrug, his arms around his knees. He was watching the fire with too much concentration. The front door hinges went without warning. 1 minute the door was holding. The next there was a sound like a gunshot metal giving under pressure. and the door swung inward and slammed against the wall, and the blizzard walked straight into the cabin. The cold was immediate and total, not a chill and assault. The fire blew sideways. The tin cups on the kitchen shelf rattled and one fell. A wall of snow and wind hit Abigail full in the face, and she turned away from it and grabbed the door with both hands and pulled. The wind was stronger than she was. She planted her feet and used every pound she had, and the door moved 6 inches, and then the wind shoved it back. Snow was already on the floor. The fire was struggling. She looked at Eli. He was on his feet by the hearth, and she could see it, starting the tight, panicked look around his eyes. The way his breathing had gone short and high in his chest, pulling in quick, shallow gasps instead of full breaths. His face had gone gray. Eli. Her voice was calm and direct. I need your help right now. Come here. He crossed the room. She pulled him in front of her and put his hands on the door beside hers. Push when I say, she said. Ready? Push. They pushed together and got the door 3/4 closed. The wind gusted again and pushed back. Eli made a sound, not quite a cry, something tighter, and his breath was coming too fast now, too shallow, that high wheezing pull at the top of his lungs. She needed both hands for the door. She needed to be with him. She couldn't do both. She made the decision in about a second and a half. She let go of the door, took Eli by the shoulders, turned him so his back was to the door, and stepped into the gap herself. She set her back flat against the wood and dug her heels into the plank floor and leaned into it with her full weight. The door held. It pressed hard against her spine and shoulder blades, the wind working at it constantly, not in bursts now, but in a steady, grinding push. She could feel it in her lower back, in the muscles across her shoulders. She kept her feet planted and her spine straight, and she pushed back. Eli, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Get to the fire. Sit close. Don't stand up. He looked at her, her broad back braced against the broken door, her boots locked against the floor, and something in his face moved past the panic into something else. He went to the fire and crouched down close to it. Now listen to me very carefully, she said. You're going to breathe slowly, in through your nose, slow as you can. Hold it a second, out through your mouth. Do that with me, she demonstrated, loud enough for him to hear over the wind. In, hold. Out. He tried it. His first few attempts were ragged, but he kept trying. Again, she said. Slower. Your lungs have room. Give them the chance to use it. In. Hold. Out. His breathing began to even. Not fully, she could still hear the wheeze underneath, but the panic was losing its grip. The shallow gasping was slowing down. Good, she said. Keep going. You're doing it right. She stayed against the door and thought fast. She needed to seal this door. She needed to treat Eli's lungs. She needed the fire to stay lit. She could do all three, but she had to be smart about the order. Eli, she said, behind you on the shelf, the third one up. There's a coil of rope. Get it and bring it here. He got the rope. She had him hold pressure on the door for 30 seconds while she lashed the handle to the iron hook on the wall beside it, a hook meant for coats, now pulling its weight in a different way entirely. The rope wasn't elegant, but it held the door shut against the wind with her weight no longer required. She stepped away from the door, rolling her shoulders once. Her back ached deep. Good, she said. Now the wood box. I need it full. Can you carry 2 pieces at a time? I can carry 4, Eli said. Then carry 4. He carried 4. While he stacked wood, she went to the kitchen and found what she needed: dried pine needles. She kept in a cloth sack near the herb tin, and the tin pot she used for steam remedies. She packed the bottom of the pot with pine needles and filled it halfway with water from the bucket she'd filled that morning. She set it on the stove's hottest eye and waited for the steam. Pine needle steam was old medicine. Her grandmother had used it, and her grandmother's mother. Before that, the oils that came off the needles when they heated were sharp and clean and opened airways that were tightening from cold and panic. It wasn't a cure for a bad asthma attack, but it gave the lungs something to work with instead of just dry, frozen air. When the steam rose, she brought the pot to the hearth and set it on the hearthstone close to Eli. who was crouched there watching her with red-rimmed eyes. "Lean toward it," she said. "Not too close, just enough to breathe the steam in." Slow breaths. He leaned in. She draped her shawl over his head and over the pot to hold the steam around him. He breathed. She watched his chest, counting the breaths. The wheeze softened after a few minutes. Not gone, but easier. He looked up at her from under the shawl, eyes still watery, face still pale. "Is this going to work?" "It's already working," she said. "Your breathing's better. Keep going." He went back under the shawl. The blizzard was still hammering the cabin, but the rope held the door, and the fire was building again, now that the wind wasn't stealing it. Abigail went back to work. She hauled 3 more loads of wood from the porch stack, going out with her arm over her face each time, the cold so sharp it felt like it was going after the skin. She smashed the ice that had formed over the water bucket in the time she'd been bracing the door. She banked the fire up high and steady. She checked Eli every few minutes. Each time his color was better. At some point in the middle of all this, she realized she was talking to him continuously not about the storm or the door or his lungs, but about ordinary things. The venison stew she planned to make, whether she thought the snow would reach the porch rail, whether he'd ever seen a blizzard worse than this one. She was doing it deliberately, giving him something to focus on other than the wheeze in his own chest. And after a while, she noticed that he was answering. Short answers, but answers. Present and thinking, and not just riding the panic. She counted that as a victory. It was full dark when the cabin door opened. Not the front door, the rope held that one, but the side door from the covered passage to the barn. Jedediah came through it in a blast of frozen air, coated in snow from his hat to his boots, his beard iced at the edges, his face raw and set in the expression of a man who has been fighting weather for hours and has not entirely won. He stopped just inside the door. He took in the front door, roped to the wall, the fire high and steady. Eli by the hearth, with a shawl draped over his head and a steaming pot in front of him, looking up at his father with tired eyes and color in his cheeks. Abigail, standing at the stove, ladle in hand, turning to look at him. He stood there in the snow, and cold air dripping from his coat onto the floor. "Eli," he said. His voice came out rougher than usual. "How are you breathing?" "Better," Eli said. Abby made pine steam. Jedediah looked at Abigail. She met his eyes and shook her head slightly, not serious, not anymore, and watched something very large move through his face and then settle. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of his son. He put one big hand on the back of Eli's neck, the way you'd check if someone was still warm. He stayed there for a moment, not saying anything. Eli let him. Then Eli did something that Abigail did not expect. He leaned forward and put his arms around his father's neck, and his face went into Jedediah's frozen shoulder, and he cried, not a loud cry, just the sudden, exhausted release of a child who has been very brave for a very long time and has finally reached the moment where he doesn't have to be anymore. Jedediah held him. His arms came up and wrapped around the boy, and he held him tight, snow still melting off his coat. Abigail turned back to the stove and gave them that moment. After a while, Eli's breathing evened out into sleep right there by the fire, wrapped in his father's coat. Jedediah eased him down onto the hearthrug and stood up slowly and came to where Abigail stood at the stove. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The door hinges?" "Gave in the first hour," she said. "I roped it. It held. You're back." "Fine." He looked at her for a while. His face was still raw from the cold, and his eyes were tired, and something in them was very direct. "He's never let anyone hold him since his mother died," he said quietly. "Not even me." "Not really." Abigail looked at the boy asleep on the hearthrug, small and still now, his chest rising and falling easy in the warm air. "He was scared," she said. "Fear makes room for things that can't get in otherwise." Jedediah didn't say anything to that, but he stood beside her at the stove for a while, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his coat, and neither of them moved away. A woman's true strength isn't measured by the size of her waist. It's measured by what she does when the door blows in and the child can't breathe and there's no one else coming. Abigail had learned that long before Blackwood Mountain. Tonight, it seemed, Jedediah Vance was learning it too. The barn smell of it hit first. Smoke, thick and black, carrying on a wind that had no business being warm in late November. Abigail came around the east corner of the cabin with her arms full of firewood and stopped. There were 4 horses at the gate, not Jedediah's gray gelding. These were different animals, heavier built, standing with the restless energy of horses that had been ridden hard and were being held in check. The men on them didn't bother dismounting. One of them, the largest, sat his horse out front like he was posing for something. He was a big man. Not tall the way Jedediah was tall, where Jedediah's size came from length and work. This man was wide, inflated, the kind of broad that suggested he'd been strong once and had let it thicken into something less disciplined. He wore a good coat, too good for the mountain, and his hat was expensive. His face was fleshy and red from the cold, and arranged in an expression of permanent contempt. "Well now," he said, "you must be the mountain man's new wife." His eyes moved over her in a way that had nothing respectful in it. Abigail set the firewood down on the porch stack, even and deliberate. She didn't rush it. "I'm Abigail Vance," she said, "and you're on private land." "Boyd," the man said. He said it like it was supposed to mean something. "I represent certain interests in the valley who have a stake in this mountain, looking for Jedediah." "He's on the range," she said. "Then I'll wait." She went inside and put more coffee on. She didn't invite them in. Jedediah came back within the hour. She watched from the kitchen window as he rode through the gate, saw him register the 4 horses, saw his face settle into something very still and very careful. He dismounted and tied his horse and walked to where Boyd sat. Without hurrying, she couldn't hear the conversation from the window, but she could read the shape of it in the men's postures. Boyd, leaning forward with something aggressive in his shoulders. Jedediah, standing square and not moving back. After a few minutes, Jedediah turned and walked to the cabin. He came through the door and looked at her. "They want the North Ridge," he said. "The rocky one. There's a water spring up there. Your spring filed on it 4 years ago. It's mine under every law that matters." She nodded. "What are they claiming?" "That the survey was done wrong, that the ridge belongs to valley land under the old territorial boundaries." He poured himself coffee and drank it standing up. "Boyd's an enforcer. He doesn't come to talk. He comes to make you tired enough to quit." She was quiet for a moment, going through what she knew. She'd spent 3 years before Silver Creek working as a clerk for a land office in Kansas, an unglamorous job that most people found tedious and that she had found genuinely interesting. Territorial land law was a thicket. Most people didn't want to push through. She had pushed through it, and she'd come out the other side, knowing exactly where the sharp edges were. "Did you file under the Homestead Act?" she asked. 1,872, he said. 5 years proof of residency and improvement. I've got the papers. "And the spring specifically? Is it documented as a water source on your claim?" He looked at her. "It is." "Then they can't touch it," she said. Under the Desert Land Act and the Territorial Water Codes, approved homestead with documented water sources holds against competing valley claims. The survey argument won't stand if your original filing was recorded with the territorial office. Jedediah was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not surprise exactly, more like reassessment. "You know land law," he said. "I know quite a bit of land law," she said. "How much is quite a bit?" "Enough to know that Boyd is counting on you not knowing yours." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come outside with me." They went out together. Boyd was still on his horse. His men had spread out slightly casual, but deliberate the way men do when they want to seem relaxed and are actually establishing positions. Boyd looked at Abigail coming out behind Jedediah, and something moved across his face that was uglier than his usual contempt. "Bringing your wife to business conversations now, Vance?" He said it with a particular kind of sneer, his eyes moving over her body in a way meant to be humiliating. I suppose if you can't find a proper. Say what you came to say about the land, Jedediah said. His voice was flat and final. Boyd's jaw tightened. He looked at Jedediah for a moment, calculating, then shifted to the water spring argument he'd laid out before. He talked about the old territorial survey boundaries. He talked about his principles in the valley and their existing water rights, and how the spring on the North Ridge drained into the valley watershed, and therefore represented a point of legitimate dispute. He had clearly said all of it before to other people. He said it smoothly, with the practiced ease of a man who'd found that most homesteaders got nervous when the language got official enough. Abigail waited until he was done. That argument doesn't hold, she said. Boyd looked at her. He'd clearly not expected her to speak. The territorial water codes established that surface water, originating on approved homestead parcel, belongs to that parcel's holder, she said. Your valley principles would need to demonstrate that the spring's primary drainage feeds their claimed acreage rather than Jedediah's. His original filing documents the spring as a water source improvement, which means it was part of his 5-year proof. That proof was accepted and recorded. You can't retroactively contest an accepted and recorded improvement without a federal court order, and any federal judge worth his bench is going to want to see your principal's original valley deed against his territorial filing date. She paused. When was their valley claim filed? Boyd's face had gone a shade darker. That's not relevant here, he said. Then you already know it's later than 1872, she said, which makes this a straightforward matter. You have no legal standing on this ridge. The silence held for a moment. Boyd looked at her with a quality of attention that was different now. Not contempt that was still there, but something colder underneath it. She'd made a mistake that was also not a mistake. She'd let him know exactly how much she understood. He couldn't bluff her. He knew it now. What that meant was that he'd stop trying to bluff and try something else. Burn it, he said. The man on his right pulled a torch from nowhere he'd had it ready, she realized. It had been on him the whole time, and rode around to the barn. No, Jedediah moved, and Boyd's other 2 men moved with him, blocking his path without quite touching him. Jedediah stopped. His hands were at his sides, and she could see what it was costing him to keep them there. The barn's south wall caught fast. Old timber, dry from years, and the man with the torch knew what he was doing. The fire moved upward in a sheet. Abigail stood in the yard and watched it burn, and did not allow herself to react the way she wanted to react. Boyd turned his horse and rode close to her. Too close. He looked down at her from the saddle with his cold, considering eyes. You think law books and land codes are going to stop us, he said. You think this mountain man brought you up here because he wants you. He leaned in, low enough that only she could hear. You think this mountain man chose you out of love? His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He just needed a meat shield to take a bullet from him. His first wife died horribly because of this very land. He straightened up and looked at her face with the clinical satisfaction of a man checking whether a blade has gone deep enough. Then he pulled his horse around and rode out through the gate. His men followed. The last one, the one who'd lit the fire, rode past without looking back. The barn burned. Abigail stood in the yard with the heat of it on her face and the black smoke rising into the cold November sky, and Boyd's words arranged themselves inside her head in a way she couldn't immediately get them to stop. A meat shield, a bullet absorber. His first wife died because of this very land. Jedediah came to stand beside her. He didn't speak. He was watching the fire with his jaw locked and his hands still at his sides, the same way he'd held them when Boyd's men had blocked him. That particular stillness of a man who has learned to hold everything in because the cost of losing it is too high. She wanted to ask him. She wanted to turn and look at him right now and ask him to tell her what Boyd meant, to tell her about his first wife and how she died, and whether any part of what Boyd had whispered was anything close to true. She didn't. Not here. Not in the yard with the barn burning and the smoke making her eyes water, and Eli watching from the cabin window, his small face pale behind the glass. She would ask, but not yet. She stood in the heat and the smoke and held herself very still and made herself breathe. And the fire burned, and she did not move. And Jedediah stood 3 feet away from her in silence, and neither of them spoke. The black smoke rose and rose against the white of Blackwood Mountain, and somewhere inside the burning structure a beam gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and Abigail flinched. Jedediah did not. The barn burned to its foundation. She waited 3 days. 3 days of doing everything she always did, starting the fire before first light, cooking breakfast, working through the chores, helping Eli with his schoolwork in the evenings. 3 days of watching Jedediah come and go from the ruins of the barn, assessing what could be salvaged, moving the remaining livestock into the smaller storage shed with quiet efficiency. 3 days of behaving as if Boyd's words hadn't lodged somewhere behind her sternum and taken up permanent residence. She was good at behaving. She'd had years of practice, but the words were there. Every time the yard went quiet, every time she caught Jedediah looking at her with that flat, unreadable expression she still hadn't fully learned to interpret, every time she washed the dishes and stared out the window at the black foundation, where the barn used to be, he just needed a meat shield to take a bullet for him. His first wife died horribly because of this very land. She'd turned those 2 sentences over so many times they'd gone smooth, like river stones. She tried to find angles where they didn't mean what they plainly said. She couldn't find enough of them. What she could find was this. Jedediah had not lied to her exactly. He'd told her he needed a wife. He'd told her he needed capable hands, a steady head, help surviving the winter. All of that was true as far as she could confirm it. He hadn't claimed to love her. He hadn't claimed anything beyond what he'd stated plainly on the platform at Silver Creek. But she had built something in her mind over these weeks, quietly and without entirely meaning to. The widened chair, the mended coat, the way he'd stood beside her at the stove while Eli slept, the way he'd looked at her across the burned-out yard, something moving behind his eyes she'd thought she was beginning to understand. Maybe she'd been building something out of kindness and practicality and reading meaning into things that had none. She knew what she was. She'd always known. She was big and plain, and had spent 32 years watching men look through her to find the woman they actually wanted. She was not naive enough to believe that a man like Jedediah Vance had looked at her on a muddy train platform and felt something romantic stir in him. She wasn't naive about herself. What scared her was the possibility that she'd been naive about him. On the 4th night, she got out of bed at 2 in the morning and packed her carpet bag. She didn't take much. What she'd arrived with, and nothing else. Her herb tin, her mending kit, her change of clothes. She folded things carefully, quietly, setting each item in the bag with the deliberate slowness of someone who is trying to be very sure about every action before they take it. She wasn't running from hard work. She wasn't running from Eli's slow, grudging warmth, or the cold of the mountain, or even from Boyd and his torches. She'd proven, at least to herself, that she could handle all of those things. She was leaving because she refused to be a shield, a placeholder, a body positioned between a man and the bullets meant for him. If that was what she was here for, she needed to know it now, before she'd given over another month, and then another, of herself to this place and these people, before the cost of leaving was higher than she could afford to pay. She could bear a lot. She could not bear being used while believing she was wanted. She picked up the carpet bag and her coat and her boots and carried them to the main room. She sat down on the bench by the door and pulled on her boots, lacing them tight, working by the low light of the banked fire. She did not let herself look at the widened chair. She stood up. "Where are you going?" His voice came from the hallway. Not startled, too quiet for that, like a man who had been awake and waiting and had decided to speak before a certain moment passed. She turned around. Jedediah stood at the mouth of the hallway in his work trousers and his undershirt. No coat, no boots, standing on the cold plank floor in his sock feet. His hair was disordered from sleep, and his face had the open, unguarded quality it only had in these odd, unwatched hours. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at her face. Away, she said. There wasn't a better word for it. He came into the room. He moved without hurrying, the way he always moved. But she could see something working behind his eyes that wasn't his usual stillness. He stopped a few feet from her because of what Boyd said, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved once, like he was deciding between several different things he could say. She waited. She'd learned by now that rushing Jedediah Vance towards speech was pointless. Then he did something she had not expected. He went to one knee. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a performance. It was just he went down, one knee on the cold floor, and he looked up at her from there, with his hands open at his sides, and the plainness of it was more affecting than any dramatic gesture she could have anticipated, because it clearly cost him something. This was not a man who bent easily. She stood very still. Jedediah, let me finish, he said. I need to say this, and I'm not good at it, so I need you to let me get through it. She closed her mouth. He looked at the floor for a moment, gathering something. Then he looked back up at her. My first wife was Sarah, he said. She was young when we married. Younger than was wise, maybe. He paused. She was not built for the hard things. She tried. I don't say that against her. But when the syndicate first came, 3 years ago, and they started with the pressure and the threats, it wore her down in a way I didn't see happening fast enough. His voice stayed level, but the effort of keeping it level was visible. One night she packed and left, took Ely's horse from the barn, and rode out in the dark toward the valley trail. There was ice on the upper switchback. I don't know if she knew how bad it was. I don't know if she was thinking clearly enough to check. Abigail understood then, before he finished it. They found her horse 2 days later, he said. Found her the day after that. She'd gone off the switchback in the dark. Ice and the dark, and he stopped. Took a breath. Ely was 7. He was asleep in the cabin when she left. I was out on the south fence. I didn't know she was gone until morning. The fire made a small sound behind her. The cabin was very quiet. Boyd knows that story, Jedediah said. He found it out, and he uses it because it's the sharpest thing he's got. He wanted to make you believe I brought you here as a replacement, that I put you in front of the trouble on purpose. He looked at her directly. That's not true. I brought you up here to protect you from the insults down below. His voice had gone quieter, but it didn't waver. But what I've been realizing since the blizzard, since you braced that door and saved my son, is that you aren't the one who needed protecting. You've been the one doing the protecting. You're healing my boy and healing me, and I didn't fully understand that when I asked you to come, but I understand it now. He held her eyes. His were dark and tired and completely without defenses. You aren't anyone's shield, he said. You are the only choice my heart has ever made. The silence that followed was long. Abigail looked at this man kneeling on a cold floor in his sock feet in the middle of the night, having just said the most words she'd ever heard him say consecutively, and she understood something she should have understood before she'd packed the bag. Jedediah Vance didn't perform. He didn't exaggerate, and he didn't soften, and he didn't say things he didn't mean. It wasn't in his construction. What he'd just said was exactly what he believed, delivered with the same straightforward precision as everything else he'd ever told her. She put the carpetbag down. He watched her do it. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but a release of something that had been held very tight. She sat down on the bench and looked at him, still kneeling there. Get up off that cold floor, she said. You'll take a chill in your knees. He stood up. He looked at her for a moment with that expression. She was still learning, the one that wasn't quite readable, but was warmer than his neutral face, in a way she'd come to recognize. I want to know about Sarah, she said. Not all at once, but over time. I want to know who she was, and I want Eli to be able to talk about her without anyone flinching. She was his mother. She should be able to exist in this house. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. She should, he said. You're right. I'm going to ask you things sometimes, she said, when I need to understand something. I need you to answer me straight. I've never answered any other way. I know, she said. That's why I'm still sitting here. He stood in the firelight and looked at her. And she looked back at him, and it wasn't a fairy story moment. There was no music, and no one was beautiful in the firelight, and neither of them said anything that would sound impressive written down. But it was real, and it was mutual. And it was the first moment since Silver Creek where she felt like they were actually in the same place, at the same time, standing on the same ground. Go back to bed, she said. It's cold, and you've got fence work in the morning. He looked like he had more to say. Then he looked at her face and apparently decided it had been said. He turned and went back down the hallway. She sat by the fire for a while longer. Then she unpacked the carpet bag, put everything away where it belonged, and went back to bed. The telegram took her 40 minutes to compose. She'd been working on it in her head for 2 days before she sat down and committed it to paper, because a telegram cost by the word, and she needed to be precise. Too much, and it would be vague. Too little, and it would be dismissed. She needed to convey exactly enough to a United States Federal Marshal's office 300 miles away that someone there would take it seriously and act on it. She'd written telegrams before, in her years at the land office, on behalf of homesteaders who didn't know how to navigate official channels. She knew the language that got read and the language that got filed under a stack of papers and forgotten. She wrote 3 drafts in the margins of Eli's arithmetic paper, crossing out and rewriting until she had it tight. Specific dates, specific property filing numbers she'd gotten from Jedediah's documents, which she'd spent an evening going through with a lamp and a magnifying glass. Specific legal statutes cited by section and paragraph. The name Boyd with his full description. The name of the syndicate, which she'd found in the fine print of a land notice. Boyd had left behind carelessly, she thought. The arrogance of a man who didn't believe anyone he intimidated would know what to do with it. She would send it from Silver Creek, which meant riding into Silver Creek. She told Jedediah the morning after the conversation by the fire. He listened to the whole plan without interrupting. He'd learned, she thought, not to interrupt her when she was working through something organized. They've filed a fraudulent deed seizure, she said. I found the notice in the county records when I went through your papers. They've claimed prior survey rights to the North Ridge and submitted it to the county clerk 2 weeks ago. If we don't contest it in person and get federal attention on it, the county clerk is going to process it. He may already be planning to. The county clerk is in Boyd's pocket, Jedediah said. I know, she said. That's exactly why we need to be standing in front of him before he processes that deed. It's a lot harder to corrupt a document when the people who can contradict it are standing right there watching you. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. And the telegram goes to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne, not the county sheriff. He may be compromised, too. Federal jurisdiction supersedes county authority on homestead disputes, especially when there's documented intimidation and arson involved. She looked at him. The barn burning is important. That's a federal crime if we document it right. He nodded, slowly, working through it. Then he said, When? Today, she said. Before they process that deed. He looked out the window. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of clear that came after storms, and made everything look sharp and close. Eli stays here, he said. I'll ask the Halverson boy to ride over and sit with him. Good, she said. We ride in 2 hours. They rode down the mountain on a morning that was too bright and too cold and completely indifferent to what they were about to do. Jedediah rode beside her, not in front, and she appreciated that without saying so. The trail was different going down than it was going up faster. The mountain opening up into wider country. the trees thinning as they came off the high timber line into the valley approach. Silver Creek announced itself first by smell, wood smoke, and horse, and the particular mineral tang of a place where too many people lived too close together. Then by sound wheels on frozen road, a hammer somewhere, voices. Then by sight, the main street opening up ahead of them like a stage revealed by a rising curtain. They rode in at a walk. People noticed. Of course they noticed. Jedediah Vance riding into town was notable by itself. Jedediah Vance riding in beside a woman was something different. Several people on the boardwalk stopped what they were doing. A man coming out of the mercantile held the door and stood there watching. Abigail looked straight ahead. She knew this town. Not personally, not yet, but she knew it the way she knew every town that had watched her walk through the mud and laughed. She knew the faces and what was in them, the idle cruelty, the quick judgment, the way her body gave people permission to decide they didn't need to see the rest of her. She kept her spine straight and her hands easy on the reins, and she rode through the middle of Silver Creek like she had every right to be there, which she did, because she did. They stopped in front of the county clerk's office. Jedediah tied the horses. Abigail climbed down and smoothed her coat and picked up the leather document case she'd borrowed from Jedediah's shelf, which now held every relevant piece of paper from his homestead filing, organized by date. She pushed the door open and walked in. The county clerk was a small man named Dutton. She'd never met him, but she recognized the type, the minor official, who had found that a small amount of power, carefully cultivated, was more comfortable than the risk of having principles. He looked up from his desk when they came in, and his face went through several expressions quickly: recognition of Jedediah, assessment of Abigail, and then a particular careful blankness that told her he already knew why they were here. "Mr. Vance," he said, "what can I do for you?" "You can explain the deed seizure notice filed against Blackwood Mountain a parcel, 472, Abigail said. She set the document case on the counter and opened it. Filed 2 weeks ago by the Consolidated Valley Land Syndicate, claiming prior survey rights to the North Ridge and its water source. I'd like to see your official receipt of that filing." Dutton looked at her. He looked at Jedediah. Jedediah looked back at him without expression. "Filing matters are generally handled by appointment. The Homestead Act, Section 4, explicitly grants the right of a recorded claimant to inspect any contesting filing against their parcel on demand," Abigail said. "The Territorial Code reinforces that right in the interests of preventing administrative fraud." She held his gaze steadily. "I'd like to see the filing, Mr. Dutton." He got the filing. It was worse than she'd expected, and also exactly what she'd expected. The syndicate's lawyers had done careful, deliberate work. The language was technical, the survey references obscure, the precedent citations selected to confuse rather than illuminate. A homesteader without legal knowledge would read this document and feel the ground shifting under their feet. That was entirely the point. She read every word. When she was done, she looked up at Dutton and said, "This filing misrepresents the territorial survey date. The survey it cites as establishing Valley Watershed jurisdiction was conducted in 1869. Mr. Vance's homestead filing and water source documentation was recorded in 1872 under the Homestead Act. Under the doctrine of prior appropriation, his recorded water right supersedes any watershed claim derived from a pre-filing survey." She put the document down on the counter. "I'm going to need you to annotate the record with a formal contest on behalf of parcel 472. Today, Dutton's mouth had gone thin. "You'll need to review it right now," Abigail said, "because I am standing here watching you, and this office is a public office, and what you do in the next few minutes is going to be part of the official record that a federal marshal is going to read when he arrives from Cheyenne." That landed. She watched it land on Dutton's face, and she watched him make a calculation. And she watched the calculation come out somewhere different then it would have come out if they hadn't been standing right there in front of him. He annotated the record. She made him read it back to her. She checked the language. She made him correct one phrase that was vague enough to be usable against them later. Then she signed her name as contesting party and made Jedediah sign his and took a copy and put it in the document case. She sent the telegram from the office next door. Word for word from her final draft, not a syllable changed. She paid for it with money from her own pocket because it had been her idea and she intended to own it completely. When they came out onto the boardwalk, the street had changed. There were more people on it. Some had been there already, going about their business, but they'd stopped going about it. They were watching. A cluster of women near the milliners. Several men outside the saloon, not the laughing men from her first day, or maybe they were. But their faces were different now, watching rather than mocking. Taking in Jedediah beside her, and the document case in her hand, and the set of her shoulders. She didn't plan what she did next. It simply became apparent that it was necessary. She turned to face the street. "Most of you know Jedediah Vance," she said. Her voice carried. She'd always had a voice that carried another thing about her body that people found inconvenient until it became useful. His homestead on Blackwood Mountain is documented, legal, and properly recorded under federal law. The Consolidated Valley Land Syndicate has filed a fraudulent deed seizure against his property with the intention of stealing a water source that has belonged to his land for 11 years. They burned his barn 3 weeks ago to intimidate him. She paused. That is arson, which is a federal crime. It has been reported to the federal marshal's office. Silence on the street. The right to live on land you've worked and proved and paid for under the law of this country, she said, does not depend on how much money your neighbor has or how many men he can hire to threaten you. It belongs to every citizen, and when men with money try to take it from men and women without, by fraud and by fire, it is everyone's problem. Not just the people whose barn is burning. She stopped. The silence held. Then one of the women near the milliners moved. She was small and gray-haired, and had the look of someone who had been watching things for a very long time and had been waiting for the right moment to stop watching. She walked forward across the road and came to stand beside Abigail. "I have documents," she said quietly. "Survey records my husband kept from the original Valley filing. The syndicate bought out our land 2 years ago, and the terms they recorded were different from the terms they offered us in person. I've kept the original for exactly this kind of occasion." Another woman followed her. Younger, dark-haired, nervous but resolved. "My family's deed is similar," she said. A third. Then a man from near the saloon, one of the working men, a miner or a laborer, with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who understands that this step can't be taken back. Not a crowd, 5 or 6 people. But they stood. Abigail looked at them. She looked at their faces, these people who had watched her kneel in the mud on her first day in Silver Creek, and laughed or looked away. She didn't say anything about that. It wasn't relevant to what was happening now. "I'll need to see those documents," she said to the gray-haired woman. "And I'll need your names in writing if you're willing. The marshal's office will want corroborating witnesses." "We're willing," the woman said. Jedediah stood beside Abigail, while the townspeople came forward, and he didn't say much. He rarely did, but once, briefly, his hand found the small of her back, a single light touch, there and then gone. She kept her eyes on the documents being pressed into her hands, but she felt it. The town of Silver Creek had laughed at her on a muddy platform 6 weeks ago. Today they were handing her evidence and speaking their names into the record. She hadn't asked anyone to change their opinion of her. She'd simply done what needed doing, and loudly enough that the people who'd been quietly needing something to rally toward had found their way toward it. Respect, Abigail had learned long ago, was not something you could ask for. You could not be humble enough to earn it, or patient enough, or quiet enough. The only thing that actually worked was being so competent and so clear and so unbothered by the people trying to diminish you that you simply outran their opinion of you. She tucked the documents into the case. There was a lot of work still ahead. Boyd and the syndicate wouldn't fold just because of a contest filing and a telegram. There was the matter of the burned barn and Eli's asthma, and the long winter still sitting on top of the mountain, and the armed men Boyd could send whenever he decided. Legal channels weren't working fast enough. She knew all of that. But standing in the Silver Creek town square, in the hard winter light, with documents in her hand and Jedediah Vance beside her, and a handful of people who'd found something worth standing up for, she allowed herself, for exactly this moment, to feel what it was. Then she closed the document case and said to Jedediah, "We should get back before dark." He nodded and untied the horses. They rode out of Silver Creek at a walk, the same as they'd ridden in, and Abigail looked straight ahead, and she did not look back at the town behind her because she didn't need to. The night came in, clear and hard. No cloud cover, which meant the cold dropped fast after sundown, and the stars came out sharp and close over the mountain. Abigail noticed the clarity of the sky when she went to the porch to bring in the last of the wood. It was beautiful. It was also, she thought, the kind of night where a man on a ridge could see a long way down and a long way across. She brought the wood in and barred the door. She didn't say anything to Jedediah about the feeling she had. She'd learned that feelings with him were best translated into action first and words second. Instead, she went to the shelf and took down his spare rifle and checked the load and set it beside the kitchen door. She put her herb kit on the table where she could reach it fast. She banked the main fire lower than usual, less visible through the windows. Jedediah came in from checking the livestock in the storage shed and saw what she'd done. He looked at the rifle by the kitchen door. He looked at her. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Boyd knows the marshal's coming. He'll have heard by now. If he's going to move, it'll be tonight or tomorrow." "Tonight," she said. "The sky's too clear. Good visibility." He nodded once, already thinking the same thing. "I'll wake Eli and move him to the root cellar." "The root cellar's stone," she said. "Good walls." "Exactly." Eli woke without complaint, which told her he'd been half awake already, lying in the dark listening to the house, the way children do when they sense adults are worried. He dressed fast and didn't ask questions. Jedediah carried the spare blankets down. Abigail brought the lantern and a canteen, and the last of the corn biscuits, wrapped in cloth. She crouched down in front of Eli, in the cellar doorway. "You stay down here with the door pulled shut," she said. "You don't come up for any reason until one of us comes for you. You hear me?" He looked at her with his dark, serious eyes. "What if neither of you comes?" She held his gaze. "We'll come," she said. "But if by some chance you need to get out on your own, the cellar door opens from inside and you go straight north into the tree line. You know those woods." "I know them," he said. "Good boy." She touched his face once, quick and light, and he didn't pull away. "Now get back from the door and stay low." She pulled the cellar door down and latched it and went back into the cabin. Jedediah had his Winchester loaded and placed by the front window, angle cut, so he could see both the gate and the south approach. He'd moved the table and extinguished all lamps except the one in the back hallway, left burning low enough light to move by, not enough to silhouette them in the windows. He handed her the double-barrel shotgun from the rack above the door. She took it. She knew shotguns. She'd grown up with one. The weight was familiar and grounding in her hands. She checked both chambers, snapped it closed, and went to the kitchen, which covered the rear angle of the cabin, the northeast corner that came in from behind the woodpile, and the old burned barn foundation. "If they come in numbers, they'll split," she said from the kitchen doorway. "Some at the front to draw your attention. Some around back to flank." "Then you've got the back," he said. "I've got the back," she agreed. They waited. An hour passed, maybe longer. The silence on the mountain was the particular deep silence that came only in the coldest part of the night, when even the wind laid down and the trees stopped moving. Abigail stood in the kitchen, with her back to the wall beside the window, not in front of it, and watched the darkness between the woodpile and the tree line. The first shot came from the south ridge. The crack of it rolled down the canyon wall and hit the cabin. And then two more shots came in fast succession, and she heard the window glass in the main room go. Jedediah returned fire once, measured, not panicked, and she heard him move along the wall to a new position. She was watching the back. There, movement in the dark beyond the woodpile. Two shapes, low and fast, coming in from the northeast corner, just like she'd said they would. They were good at moving in the dark. But the snow reflected just enough starlight that their shadows preceded them. She had maybe 30 seconds. She needed to slow them down, not just stop them. Two men coming in from the back, while Jedediah was occupied with the front, was a pincer they couldn't fight from inside the cabin. She needed to collapse one arm of it. She went out the kitchen side door, low and fast, staying in the shadow of the porch overhang, her boots in the snow making almost no sound because she'd wrapped them in burlap before the weight, an old trick from her father, hunting in wet country. The cold hit her face and hands, but she was moving and the movement kept her sharp. The woodpile was 8 feet high and 20 feet long, seasoned oak and pine stacked with Jedediah's obsessive care. She'd looked at that woodpile every morning for weeks, and somewhere in the back of her mind she'd already mapped it. She went around the far end of it, put it between herself and the two approaching men, and waited at the corner. She heard them coming, the creak of snow under boot, the low, quick sound of one man saying something to another. Getting closer, she stepped out and fired the first barrel into the snowdrift directly in front of them. The blast of it in the cold night air was enormous, a physical thing. The sound rolling off the canyon walls and coming back doubled. The snowdrift erupted. The two men hit the ground by pure reflex, the way anyone does when a shotgun goes off 8 feet in front of them. One scrambled up and ran. The other rose to one knee reaching for his weapon, and she leveled the second barrel at him and said, "Don't." He looked at her, a big man, wide-shouldered, one hand extended toward a revolver that was just out of his reach in the disturbed snow. "You reach for that," she said, "and I put this barrel through the wall of your chest. Back up and put your hands where I can see them." He backed up. He put his hands up. "Face down in the snow," she said, "arms out." He went face down. She heard the shooting at the front of the cabin stop. Then Jedediah's voice, flat and carrying, "Drop it now." A pause, "Down on the ground, both of you." Then, quiet. The quiet after a gunfight was different from ordinary quiet. Thicker, somehow. Abigail stood in the snow, with the shotgun leveled, and listened to her own breathing, and waited to be sure before she let herself think it was over. The man in the snow in front of her didn't move. "Abby?" Jedediah's voice from the front corner of the cabin. "Back here," she said. "I've got one down." Another ran northwest into the trees. She heard him move around the cabin. He came around the corner with his rifle up and took in the scene, the man face down in the snow, Abigail standing over him with the shotgun, the single set of running tracks leading into the tree line. He looked at her. He looked at the shotgun in her hands and the set of her face and the fact that she was standing and had both barrels accounted for. "The other two are secured at the front," he said. "Boyd wasn't with them." "Boyd wouldn't be," she said. "Boyd sends men." Jedediah crouched down and removed the revolver from the snow near the downed man's hand, then took the man by the collar and hauled him to his feet. The man was young, she saw now, 25 at most, scared, which she hadn't expected to see so plainly. "The others are the same," Jedediah said, reading her expression. "Hired men, miners mostly, from the look of them. They burned the barn," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe the barrel man did that, and these ones were recruited after." He looked at the young man. "Who hired you?" The young man looked between the two of them. "Boyd," he finally said. $4 a man. $4. She thought about that for a moment, the particular arithmetic of desperate men. "Are there more of you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just us four." She and Jedediah looked at each other over the young man's head. Root cellar, she said. For tonight. All four of them, root cellar, he agreed. They secured all four men by firelight. Jedediah tied their hands with rope he kept in the workshop. Good rope, more than enough. Abigail collected the weapons and put them in the locked chest in the main room. The young man who'd gone face down in the snow kept watching her with a kind of stunned expression, as if she had not fit any model he'd prepared for when he'd been hired to intimidate a homestead. That was the whole point. She went and got Eli from the cellar after the men were secured. He came up the ladder and looked around the cabin, the broken window glass. The smell of gunpowder still sharp in the air, his father's face, Abigail's boots still wrapped in burlap. He looked at all of it with those dark, serious eyes. "Is it done?" he asked. "For tonight," Jedediah said. Eli looked at Abigail. "Did you shoot somebody?" "I shot a snowdrift," she said. "On purpose. It worked out." He stared at her for another moment. Then something happened on his face that she hadn't quite seen there before, not the grudging almost acceptance of the past weeks, but something fuller and less cautious. "Good," he said. She sent him back to bed. Then she went to the kitchen and put water on and stood at the stove while it heated, and let her hands shake for a while, because they needed to, and nobody could see them. This was her home. She'd proven it tonight, in every way a person could. The federal marshal arrived 2 days later. He came up the mountain trail with 2 deputies and a warrant that covered Boyd, 3 named associates in the Consolidated Valley Land Syndicate's leadership, and the county clerk Dutton, whose cooperation with the fraudulent deed filing had been documented in enough detail to make the case straightforward. His name was Marshal Cord Briggs, a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had stopped being impressed by complexity. He read the documents Abigail had prepared with complete attention, asked 2 clarifying questions about the territorial water code citations, and then said, "This is solid work, Mrs. Vance." She appreciated that he didn't sound surprised. He took the 4 hired men off their hands that morning. The young one, it turned out his name, was Caleb Marsh, and he had a wife in the valley and a debt from a bad season, told the marshal everything he knew about Boyd's operations in exchange for reduced charges. Abigail had expected as much. $4 was not enough money to stay loyal through a federal arrest. She rode down to Silver Creek with Jedediah and the marshal's party. Boyd was found at his usual table in the back room of the Silver Creek Hotel, which was where men like Boyd always were comfortable and close to their information, and convinced, right up until the moment of arrest, that they had more time. He looked up when the marshal walked in, and his face went through the specific sequence of a man calculating and finding the numbers won't work. He looked past the marshal at the doorway. He saw Abigail standing there. She watched him understand. Not all at once in pieces. The way a structure comes apart when the main beam goes. The telegrams she'd sent, the county record she'd contested in person, the witness documents from the gray-haired woman and the others in the town square. All of it assembled into something a federal court would have no difficulty reading. Boyd was good at intimidation. He was not, it turned out, good at being out-prepared. Marshal Briggs was brief and professional about it. Boyd was on his feet and in irons before he'd said 10 words, none of them useful. His 2 named associates were collected from the hotel dining room and from the livery where one of them had been, apparently, planning to leave in a hurry. Dutton, the clerk, surrendered without being asked. He'd seen them coming down the main street and was already standing outside his office with his coat on, as if he'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. The arrests were done by mid-morning. The street came out to watch. That was the thing about small towns word, moved faster than horses. By the time the marshal's party walked the prisoners down the main street of Silver Creek, there were people on both boardwalks, working men, families. The gray-haired woman, whose name Abigail had learned was Mrs. Aldrich, stood in front of the milliners with her hands folded and watched Boyd pass with an expression of long postponed satisfaction. Abigail walked beside Jedediah on the street, not the boardwalk. They moved at a steady pace, not hurrying. She was aware of the watching she'd been watched on this street before, in a very different way, and she understood that it was different now. She didn't need to perform the difference. It was already there in the way people held themselves and where they looked. Several men took off their hats as she passed, not as a gesture to Jedediah, though some of them were certainly directed at him too. But she was looking, and she could distinguish it, the particular, direct nod of a man acknowledging someone he has reassessed. There was no drama in it, just a hat coming off, and a chin going down, and the clear communication of a change in the record. She nodded back at each one. Mrs. Aldrich stepped down off the boardwalk as she passed and fell into step beside her for a few yards. "The survey documents I gave you," she said quietly. "Will they help our case? My husband's land." "Yes," Abigail said. "I've made copies. The marshal has them. You'll be contacted by the federal land office when the syndicate's holdings are reviewed, and your original deed terms will be evidence in that review." She paused. "It won't be fast. These things never are, but the record is there now, and records don't disappear the way they used to." Mrs. Aldrich nodded. She stepped back up onto the boardwalk and watched them pass. Marshal Briggs finished his business in Silver Creek by early afternoon. He found Abigail and Jedediah at the telegraph office, where Abigail was sending a follow-up communication to the federal land office in Cheyenne, confirming the arrests and the contested deed status. He waited until she was done. "You've done federal quality work on this documentation, Mrs. Vance," he said. "If you ever want paid employment doing it, the marshal's office could use someone who can read a land filing the way you can." She looked at him. It was a genuine offer, simply stated, no embellishment. She respected that. "I have a ranch to run," she said, "but I appreciate it." He tipped his hat and left to rejoin his deputies. Jedediah was standing behind her. She turned and found him watching her with that expression she'd learned over the past weeks, the one that wasn't neutral, the one that was warm, in a way he didn't broadcast, but also didn't try to hide from her anymore. "Federal employment," he said. "I said no," she said. "I heard you." A pause. "Mrs. Aldrich's property. The deed issue, I know," she said. "There are probably a dozen others in the valley with the same problem. The syndicate didn't just come after you. They worked the whole region." She looked out at the street. "Someone needs to help them navigate the federal review process, or half of them will make errors in their filings and lose ground they should keep." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a long project." "Yes," she said. "You planning to take it on?" She looked at him. "You planning to object?" "No," he said, very directly. No hesitation. "I'm planning to build you a desk." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, completely serious. "A good one," he added, "the kind that holds weight." She turned back to the street so he wouldn't see her face just then. They rode back up the mountain in the afternoon light. The two of them on the trail they'd ridden so many times now that the horses knew it. The cold was there, but thin, the hard edge of it beginning, just barely, to carry the suggestion of something other than itself, a quality of the light, maybe, or the smell of the air at the lower altitudes. Too early to call it spring. But winter was no longer absolute. The mountain rose above them, and the homestead was waiting at the top of it. And Eli was up there in the house they'd defended together, and the barn foundation was still black and cold. But the timber for rebuilding was already stacked in the storage shed, ordered and paid for, waiting for thaw. There was a great deal of work still to do. Abigail found she was looking forward to it. Spring came to Blackwood Mountain, the way it always came to high country, arguing with winter every step of the way. The snow didn't melt so much as surrender, retreating in patches, giving up the south-facing slopes first, and holding longest in the shadows under the big pines. The creek that had been locked solid since November groaned and cracked, and eventually moved again. The first wildflowers came up through the mud in the meadow below the north ridge, Small, tough, yellow, absolutely indifferent to the fact that there'd been a gunfight nearby a few months ago. Abigail found them on a morning walk and crouched down and looked at them for a while. The barn was rebuilt by early April. Jedediah had organized it with the same methodical care he brought to everything good timber. Properly fitted, the new hinges heavy enough to take any wind the mountain could throw at them. Several men from Silver Creek had ridden up to help raise the frame. Mrs. Aldrich's son came with two others from the valley, men whose families were working through the federal land review with Abigail's help. They stayed 2 days and worked hard and ate well, and when they left, the barn stood solid against the mountain sky. Eli had worked beside his father the entire 2 days, not in the way of a boy being kept busy, in the way of a boy learning a thing. He handed boards and held levels, and at one point climbed the half-built frame to run a rope through a high pulley, and Jedediah watched him do it with an expression that Abigail, catching it from across the yard, understood completely. The boy was going to be fine. He'd been going to be fine for a while. She'd known it since the night of the blizzard, since he'd thrown his arms around his father and cried himself out, since the morning after, when he'd come to breakfast and told her without preamble that he'd decided the pine steam had worked, and he wanted to know how it did that. She'd explained about volatile oils and airway inflammation, and he'd listened with complete attention, and then said, "Can you teach me the other ones too? The other plants and what they do?" She'd said yes. Of course she'd said yes. He'd been following her through the herb garden since the first warm week, identifying plants, learning their properties, asking the relentless specific questions of a child who has found a subject he actually cares about. His long division had improved substantially since the fall, which she mentioned to Jedediah, who said, "He applies himself when it interests him," with the rueful tone of a man describing himself at age 10. The desk appeared in the front room in March. She came down one morning and it was there, positioned to face the window with the best light, built from the same dark oak as the dining table, with 2 deep drawers and a surface wide enough to spread 3 document pages side by side. The joints were tight and smooth. The drawers ran without catching. There was a small shelf above, sized precisely for the row of law references she'd accumulated. It was a very good desk. She stood in front of it for a moment and ran her hand along the surface and didn't say anything for a while. Jedediah came in from the porch with coffee. "You measured the books?" she said. "I measured the books," he confirmed. She sat down at it. It fit her. The height was right. The space underneath was right. The chair he'd placed at it. She recognized the chair, a solid one from the workshop she hadn't seen before, gave her proper support across the back. Every dimension of it was calibrated to how she actually sat and worked, not to some abstract idea of a desk. She was not going to cry about a piece of furniture. She had a firm policy about that. "It's good work," she said. "It should be," he said. "I made it 3 times." She looked up at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with both cups of coffee, expression straight, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was quietly pleased with himself. 3 times, she said. First one was too narrow. Second one, the drawer runners were off. He shrugged. Third one was right. She took the cup he extended and turned back to the window and the mountain beyond it, and thought, not for the first time, that this was what a man sounded like when he was actually paying attention to you, not performing attention. Paying it, going back and doing the thing again, because the first way wasn't accurate to who you were. She was still learning to simply receive that. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late April, in the high meadow below the North Ridge. It was Jedediah's suggestion, which surprised her. He'd raised it one evening while they were going over the spring planting list quietly, in the same tone he used for practical matters, as if it were equally practical, which she understood by now how he expressed things that mattered most to him. "The meadow's going to be in flower by end of month," he'd said. "If that's a thing you'd want." She'd looked at him across the table. "It's a thing I'd want," she'd said. He'd nodded, and gone back to the planting list. Mrs. Aldrich came up the mountain with her daughter. The Halverson family came. 3 other families from the valley, people Abigail had been working with through the land review, people who had found their way to a kind of trust with her through the months of shared paperwork and hard results. Marshall Briggs sent a letter of congratulation because he couldn't make the ride. Eli stood beside his father in a clean shirt that Abigail had mended at the collar the night before, pressing the seam flat while he sat very still and let her do it, a thing that would have been unthinkable in October. The circuit preacher was a short man with a big voice that the mountain caught and threw back pleasantly. He kept the words simple and direct, which suited everyone present. When it was done, and the small crowd had congratulated them and found the food Mrs. Aldrich had organized on the long table set up at the meadow's edge, Jedediah drew Abigail away from the group to the upper end of the meadow where the land rose slightly, and you could see across the whole valley below and the high peaks beyond. They stood there for a moment looking at it. Then he turned to her and pulled her close against his chest, and she went, and he held her there with both arms, and the mountain wind came across the meadow and moved through the wildflowers and her hair, and the tall, dry grass at the ridge edge. His voice came quiet and even barely above the wind. They say, "I chose a woman discarded by the world," he said, "but they don't know that you were the one who chose to save me and give me a real home." She stayed against him for a long moment. Below them, the meadow was full of yellow flowers and people eating, and Eli's voice, carrying up from somewhere, talking fast to the Halverson boy about something, animated in the way he'd become these last months. The valley spread out below, green showing through the last of the brown at the lower elevations. The peaks still white above, but a softer white now, the hard blue-gray of winter gone. Put her hand flat against Jedediah's chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, like the man himself. "You gave me one, too," she said. "Don't leave that part out." He didn't argue the point. He was too honest to argue true things. They stood on the high meadow, and the spring light moved around them, and below them the life they had built, fought for, survived, repaired, rebuilt, chosen deliberately, and kept choosing through every difficult thing the mountain had sent, went on in the ordinary, irreplaceable way of real things. The wildflowers were everywhere. Blackwood Mountain, which did not care about any of them, was beautiful anyway. Abigail Vance arrived in Silver Creek with $11, a tin of chamomile, and a body the whole town felt entitled to mock. She fell in the mud on her first day. She stood back up without asking anyone for help, and by the time winter was done with Blackwood Mountain, she had braced a broken door with her own back to save a child's life, faced down an armed enforcer with land law she'd taught herself, fired a shotgun in the dark to protect a home that nobody had originally given her. She had simply claimed it, one quiet act at a time. That is the heart of this story, not the romance, though the romance is real. Not the gunfight, though the stakes were life and death. The heart of it is this: dignity is not something other people hand you. It is something you carry inside yourself and refuse to put down, even when the mud is cold and the laughter is loud and the whole world seems to have decided you don't deserve to stand. Jedediah Vance wasn't a perfect man. He was grieving, guarded, and not especially good at saying the things that needed saying. But he was honest, and he was paying attention, and when he saw a woman deliver a foal in a blizzard and give away her last biscuit without a word of complaint, he understood something that the rest of the town had missed entirely, that real strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up and does the work. What this story asks us to consider is simple, but not easy. How many people do we overlook because of what they look like? How many times do we let the surface of a person, their size, their appearance, the way the crowd has already decided to treat them, stand in for the whole truth of who they are? Abigail was never the problem. The town's inability to see her clearly was the problem. And the moment she stopped waiting for their permission to matter and simply acted with everything she had, the ground shifted under everyone's feet. There is also something worth sitting with in the way Jedediah loved her. He didn't make speeches about it, at least not at first. He fixed the porch steps. He widened the chair. He built the desk 3 times until the dimensions were right. Not right in some general sense, but right for her specifically, for how she actually sat and worked and moved through the world. That is what real regard looks like. Not performance, not grand gestures designed to be witnessed. Just a person paying close enough attention to you that their actions become a mirror, showing you that you have been seen. And Eli, that boy who crossed his arms and shut his door and refused to let anyone in. He came around not because anyone forced him to, but because Abigail was consistent and patient and did not need him to love her in order to take care of him. She taught him long division. She explained volatile plant oils and airway medicine. She kept talking to him through the blizzard about ordinary things, so he had something to hold on to besides the panic in his chest. Children do not open up on command. They open up when they finally believe that the person in front of them is going to stay. So if there is one thing to take from this story, one thing worth carrying out of Blackwood Mountain and back into your own life, it is this. The world will have opinions about you. It will laugh sometimes. It will assign you a category and expect you to stay in it. And you have every right to stand up out of the mud, straighten your hat, pick up your bag, and walk forward anyway. Not because someone gave you permission, not because the crowd finally came around, but because you know what you're worth, and you've decided to act like it. That is what Abigail did, every single day, in every small choice. On a mountain that didn't care about any of them, she chose herself. And in doing so, she gave everyone around her the chance to rise. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, locations, events, and dialogue are entirely fictional and do not represent any real persons, living or dead, or actual historical events. Any resemblance to real individuals or situations is purely coincidental. The legal references, land codes, and historical frameworks depicted are used as narrative devices to serve the story and should not be taken as accurate legal or historical documentation. This content is intended for a mature audience and is produced solely for creative and inspirational value.